I never imagined that the day I buried my husband would also be the day my own son buried me in shame. The church was filled with flowers and whispered prayers, yet all I could hear was the sound of betrayal. He walked in tall and certain with a woman clinging to his arm, a woman who had no right to stand in my family's place. And before I could even breathe, his words cut through the silence. Dad loved her more than you. 33 years of marriage, 33 years of loyalty and sacrifice erased in a single sentence. I felt the ground slip beneath me as if I were no longer a wife, no longer a mother, but a stranger to the very life I had built with my own hands. The church smelled faintly of lilies and candle wax, a mixture that pressed on my chest as heavily as the grief already lodged there. I sat in the front pew, hands folded tightly in my lap, the black dress I'd worn a dozen times to funerals, suddenly feeling alien on my own body. This time it was for my husband, Robert. After 33 years of marriage, I was a widow at 58. People filed past me whispering condolences that sounded more like small talk than comfort. I caught snippets of gossip as I lowered my gaze, words about how he was never truly hers, and everyone knew he favored someone else. Their voices stung worse than the organ's dirge. I kept my spine straight even as my heart wavered. Robert had not been perfect, but he had been my partner, the father of our son. That had to mean something. I tried to hold on to that thought as the choir sang and the minister spoke about faith and endurance. My eyes burned not just from tears, but from the weight of being judged by every pair of eyes in that church. Grief should have been enough, but grief was not all they had given me. The doors at the back creaked open, pulling everyone's attention. I turned and my breath caught. My son David walked in taller and broader now at 32 than I remembered when he still leaned on me for everything. Beside him was a woman I had never seen, her hand wrapped around his arm, her head held high like she belonged. Her dark hair gleamed under the stained glass light. Her dress far too bold for a funeral, and yet everyone's gaze followed her as if she were royalty. A ripple of whispers ran through the pews. I rose halfway before I realized my legs were trembling. My son, my only child, barely glanced at me. He guided the woman down the aisle, not toward me, but toward the casket. They stopped in front of Robert's portrait. I watched frozen as David cleared his throat and rested his hand on the woman's back. "This is Caroline," he announced, his voice sharp and carrying. She was important to Dad. More important than... He paused, his eyes flicking toward me with something I couldn't read. Anger, maybe resentment, but certainly no warmth. Then he said it, each word like a nail in my chest. "Dad loved her more than you." The church went silent. Not even the baby in the back pew dared to cry. I heard a collective intake of breath, followed by the low hum of whispers, words I couldn't piece together because my ears rang with the echo of what he'd just said. Loved her more than me. Loved her more than his wife of 33 years, the mother of his son, the woman who had held his hand through sickness, through job losses, through long nights of building a life together. My fingers gripped the wooden pew so hard I felt the edge cut into my palm. I wanted to shout, to demand what he meant, but my voice died in my throat. Instead, I stood rooted there, my lips trembling, my heart pounding. Faces turned toward me. Neighbors, friends, colleagues of Robert's. All of them staring as though I were the intruder at my own husband's funeral. Some eyes brimmed with pity, others with judgment, and a few with outright scorn. I thought I heard someone mutter, "We all knew." Another hissed. "Poor woman." My skin burned as if every word were being branded onto me. Caroline didn't flinch. She kept her chin high, her lips curving in the faintest smile, as though this moment were meant for her, as though I were just a placeholder who had finally been removed from the stage. My chest tightened with humiliation, with disbelief. I had given my life to this family, and in one breath my son had stripped me of it in front of everyone. The minister shifted uncomfortably at the pulpit, his hands fumbling with the Bible. For a moment I thought he might intervene, say something to restore dignity to the service. But he didn't. He glanced at me, then looked quickly away. Even he couldn't bear to meet my eyes. I sank back down onto the pew, my knees no longer able to hold me. My whole body trembled not from grief alone, but from a sense of betrayal so deep it threatened to consume me. I wanted to scream at David to ask him how he could wound me like this, how he could honor a stranger while tearing down his own mother. But the words stayed trapped inside. Instead, I swallowed them, tasting salt and bitterness. I forced myself to look at Robert's casket, polished wood gleaming under the dim lights. The man inside had been my husband, but in that moment, he felt like a stranger too. If what David said was true, then who had I been living beside all those years? Who had I shared a bed with, built a home with? My throat tightened with questions I had no strength to ask. The service dragged on, though I barely heard a word. My mind replayed David's sentence again and again. Dad loved her more than you. Each repetition cut deeper, hollowing me out from within. I clenched my fists in my lap, nails biting into skin, grounding myself so I wouldn't break down in front of them all. If they wanted to see me crumble, I would not give them that satisfaction. Not here, not now. Still, when the final hymn rose and the congregation stood, I remained seated, my legs refusing to move. My vision blurred, but I blinked until the tears receded, unwilling to let them fall. I sat in silence, breathing slowly, clinging to the one thread of dignity I still possessed, my composure. Yet inside the foundations of my world had already cracked. And as I watched my son place his hand gently over Caroline's, my heart whispered the truth I didn't want to admit. Something far worse than death had been buried that day. The house was unbearably quiet when I returned from the funeral, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes you feel smaller with each step. I set my purse on the hall table and touched the family photos that still lined the wall. Robert's smile, David's childhood grin, my own younger face beside them. For a fleeting moment I tried to hold on to the comfort of those memories, but the echo of David's words in the church chased me down the hallway like a shadow I couldn't escape. I hadn't been home more than half an hour when I heard the front door open without a knock. I froze my hand on the stair banister. Heavy footsteps followed, then the sharp click of heels. I turned and there they were, David and Caroline, walking into my living room as though they owned it. David didn't even bother to take off his coat. Caroline sank into the armchair Robert used to favor crossing her legs with a confidence that chilled me. Her perfume lingered in the air, cloying and invasive, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I thought we should settle this sooner rather than later. David said, his voice clipped businesslike. He held a large cream envelope in his hand, its weight obvious. I stared at it, unable to breathe. Dad made changes before he passed. He wanted to make sure things were fair. Fair, I whispered. My throat felt dry, as if the word itself could hardly pass through. After 33 years in this house, after everything Caroline interrupted with a smirk. He left everything to us, to the people who mattered most to him in the end. She leaned back, her manicured nails tapping on the armrest as if she were measuring my reaction for amusement. You'll want to start packing. I reached for the envelope with trembling fingers. My hands shook so badly I could hardly slide my thumb under the flap. The paper inside was thick, the kind used for official documents, and my name jumped out at me in sharp black ink. I didn't have to read much. The words bled together, but the meaning was clear: the house, the accounts, the shares in Robert's company. Gone. My entire life carved out and handed to someone else. I let the papers fall back into the envelope, clutching it to my chest like it might burn through me. How could you? My voice cracked. Son. I wasn't sure if I was speaking to my son, to Robert's memory, or to God himself. This is my home. This is where I raised you, David. He shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. It's not yours anymore. Dad didn't think you needed it. He trusted me to take care of things. You'll be fine. Fine. I laughed bitterly, the sound catching in my throat. You're throwing me out of my own house and you think I'll be fine. Caroline tilted her head, her lips curving in a false smile. Don't be dramatic. You've had a good run here. But let's face it, you're alone now. You don't need a place this big. You'll be more comfortable somewhere. Smaller." She let the word linger, slicing through me like glass. I looked at my son, searching for any trace of the boy who used to run into my arms, who used to ask me to check for monsters under his bed. All I saw was coldness, a stranger wearing his face. "You'd do this to your mother?" I asked softly. David's gaze hardened. "You have 24 hours. By tomorrow night, I want you out. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The silence after his words was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face, the room tilting slightly. 24 hours. 33 years of marriage, of family dinners, of Christmas mornings by the fireplace, all reduced to a deadline like I was some tenant overstaying her lease. My knees buckled and I sank onto the sofa, clutching the envelope as though it might anchor me. Caroline rose smoothly, smoothing her dress. "We'll be back tomorrow to make sure everything's in order." She glanced around the living room, her eyes appraising the furniture, the photographs, the heirlooms, as though she were already cataloging what was hers. "Don't leave a mess." I swallowed the scream building in my chest. Instead, I pressed my lips together until they hurt. They walked toward the door, David pausing only long enough to look back at me. For a second, his eyes softened, but then he turned away, and the sound of the door slamming shut reverberated through the house. I sat, in the silence, clutching the envelope, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. Every corner of that house told the story of my life. Birthdays, celebrated nights, spent comforting a sick child, holidays where we strung lights together. And now I was to be erased from it like chalk washed from a board. The humiliation burned as hot as the grief. To lose Robert was one wound, but to have my son stand over me and strip away my home. It was unbearable. I rose slowly, walking through each room, trailing my fingers across the walls. In the dining room, I could almost hear the echo of laughter from years gone by. In the kitchen, the scent of Sunday roasts seemed to linger. Upstairs, David's old room still held the marks of a childhood lived. Posters on the wall, a scuffed desk. The memories of me tucking him in at night. I clutched the banister, my chest heaving with the weight of it all. Tomorrow it would no longer be mine. Tomorrow I would be cast out with nothing but what I could carry. The thought nearly broke me. But somewhere deep inside, under the grief and humiliation, a small ember of resolve flickered. They thought they had written me out of this story. They thought they could take everything and leave me with nothing. I pressed the envelope flat on the dining table and whispered into the emptiness, "This isn't over." Then I turned off the lights, the house sinking into shadows, and climbed the stairs to face the longest night of my life. The house creaked in the stillness, every sound amplified in the silence of the night. I couldn't sleep, not with the envelope lying like a curse on the dining table downstairs. My chest felt heavy, my thoughts restless, pulling me toward Robert's study. That room had always been his sanctuary, a place I respected, a place I rarely entered unless invited. But now he was gone, and the weight of his secrets pressed at me. I lit a small lamp and stepped inside, the smell of leather and old paper hitting me like a memory of him. The desk was as he had left it, neatly stacked files, a glass paperweight pens aligned with military precision. For a moment I almost turned back, but something inside whispered that the answers I needed were here. My hand skimmed along the drawers one after another until I reached the bottom right. It stuck slightly when I pulled. That hesitation gave me a chill. I tugged harder and it slid open with a reluctant groan. Buried beneath old tax forms and faded photographs was a worn, leather-bound book. My breath caught. I knew Robert never kept a diary. At least I thought he didn't. I lifted it slowly, the leather cool against my palms, the edges frayed as though it had been handled in secrecy. The first page bore his handwriting, unmistakable, sharp and precise. My heart pounded as I began to read. August 14th, 2008. Caroline and I met again today. I can't stay away. She makes me feel alive in a way Eleanor never could. My hands trembled. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Caroline? The same woman who had sat in my living room hours ago smirking as she claimed my husband's legacy. My throat tightened with rage and disbelief. How long had this been going on? I flipped through page after page, each one worse than the last. There were details. Meetings at hotels, secret weekends when I thought he was traveling for work, notes about the gifts he had bought her, and always the comparisons as though my life's devotion had meant nothing. But it wasn't just the affair. As I turned deeper into the diary, another layer of horror unfolded. Moved funds again today, offshore accounts secure. Daniel must never know. If Eleanor finds out, I'll make it look like she's the one pulling the strings. My breath hitched. My knees nearly buckled. Robert hadn't only betrayed me with another woman. He had been laundering money, millions of dollars hidden, and he had prepared to frame me if anyone uncovered it. Page after page, the confessions poured out cold and calculated. Transactions, names of banks, amounts that made my head spin. 50 million, 70 million. Numbers I couldn't fathom. He had recorded everything, not out of guilt, it seemed, but out of pride, as though he admired his own deception, and interwoven in it all were notes about David. Subtle manipulations, half-truths designed to poison my own son against me. David trusts me. If Eleanor pushes back, he'll take my side. He must believe she's weak, selfish. That way, when the time comes, he won't question me. I pressed the book to my chest and staggered back from the desk. My entire marriage, my entire life with Robert unraveled with every word I read. I had thought losing him to death was the end of my suffering, but this was worse. He had chosen to betray me long before the cancer, long before the casket and the lilies and the tears. He had built a web meant to strangle me even after he was gone. I sank into the chair, sobs breaking through, muffled by the leather-bound pages clutched to my heart. The man I had lain beside for 3 decades had not only been unfaithful, he had plotted against me, turned my son into a weapon, left me abandoned and despised. My tears burned, but beneath the grief something else stirred. For the first time since the funeral, a spark of clarity cut through the haze of sorrow. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining the cruelty or the injustice. Here in my hands was proof. Proof that I had been wronged in ways no one else could see. Proof that my son had been used, manipulated, fed lies until he believed his mother undeserving of love. I turned to the last entry written in a hurried scrawl just weeks before his death. The doctors say it's spreading. Time is running out. Caroline wants assurances, but I can't risk giving her everything until the paperwork is final. Eleanor is suspicious. If she digs too far, I'll make sure she takes the fall. Better a bitter widow than a jailed man. A shudder ran through me, cold and violent. He had planned to sacrifice me, his wife, the woman who stood by him through every storm to protect himself and his mistress. The betrayal was complete. The love I thought we shared, the loyalty I had given freely, was nothing but an illusion. My breath came shallow, my eyes burning. Yet as I wiped my tears, I felt steel harden in my chest. He was gone, but his lies were not. His betrayal had cut me to the bone, but in his arrogance, he had left me a weapon. I closed the diary and held it firmly. It wasn't just a record of his sins, and it was my salvation. Caroline could smirk all she wanted, David could cast me aside. But the truth was here, written in Robert's own hand. They thought I was powerless, that I would shrink into silence. They were wrong. For the first time since the casket was lowered into the ground, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt the weight of power shifting ever so slightly into my hands. The next afternoon, sunlight streamed weakly through the curtains, but the warmth did nothing to ease the cold dread in my stomach. I had been awake since dawn, moving slowly from room to room, touching the walls, letting my fingers linger over photographs and trinkets. I wasn't sure I would ever see again. The diary sat hidden in my purse, tucked beneath scarves in the closet until the moment I would walk out the door. Its weight was the only thing giving me strength. At exactly 2 o'clock, the front door opened without a knock. Caroline's laugh rang out sharp and confident, and David followed close behind her, a suitcase in each hand. I was standing in the hallway when they entered, my hands clasped to stop them from shaking. Caroline dropped her purse on the entryway table as if it already belonged to her, and swept her gaze across the room with the arrogance of a queen entering her palace. "This family was never yours," she said lightly, almost with amusement. Her eyes glinted, daring me to protest. I inhaled slowly, forcing my voice steady. "I just want to gather a few things, mementos, nothing more." David stepped forward, his frame blocking the staircase. "You've had your time, Mom. We told you to be out by now. Don't make this worse." His voice was flat, stripped of the softness that used to call me Mom with affection. I looked at him, really looked at him, searching for some piece of the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read to him. His eyes were cold, his jaw set. He was a stranger standing in my son's skin. "I won't fight you," I whispered, my hands trembling slightly, though I kept them at my sides. "I only ask for permission to take a few things upstairs. Photos, my mother's ring. That's all." Caroline moved closer, her perfume choking the air. "Why cling to trinkets? It's pathetic. Robert's real life wasn't with you, and you know it." She tilted her head, smiling as if my pain amused her. I kept my lips pressed together, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reply. My silence seemed to irritate her more than words would have. She turned to David. "Don't let her play games. Keep her downstairs." He placed a hand on the banister, physically blocking my way. My chest tightened at the gesture. It was one thing for Caroline to spit venom, but another for my own son to stand guard against me. "Mom," he said firmly, "don't push this. We can pack your things and send them later." The humiliation stung, but I swallowed it down. Arguing would only feed their triumph. I lowered my gaze, nodding slightly. "Fine," I murmured. "Just let me get my purse." Caroline smirked, already turning her attention to the living room as if mentally rearranging furniture. David's shoulders relaxed slightly. He thought I had surrendered. I walked into the hallway closet, pulling my purse from behind folded coats. My fingers brushed against the diary, hidden deep inside its presence like a heartbeat beneath the leather. I slid it carefully into the bag, my movements calm, deliberate. Outwardly, I looked beaten, a widow retreating into silence, but inside a fire burned low and steady. When I stepped back into the hallway, David moved aside, no longer seeing me as a threat. Caroline was already flipping through the mail on the entry table, humming under her breath. I looked around one last time, letting my eyes linger on the staircase, the walls, the photographs that had borne witness to a lifetime. I let the grief wash over me, then drew a deep breath. "I'll go," I said softly, adjusting the strap of my purse on my shoulder. My voice wavered, but I steadied it. "I won't cause trouble." David gave a short nod, his eyes avoiding mine. Caroline's smile widened, satisfied, victorious. Neither of them noticed the way my hand gripped the purse just a little tighter. I opened the door, the cool Boston air rushing in, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves. As I stepped outside, I felt the weight of the diary pressing against my side, a secret no one else knew I carried. To them, I was leaving broken, discarded. But I knew the truth. I had walked out with the only weapon that could turn everything upside down. The door closed behind me with a final thud, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to breathe. Rebecca opened the door before I even had a chance to knock twice. Her face, lined with age but softened by warmth, crumpled when she saw me standing there with my small suitcase. She pulled me into her arms without a word, and for the first time since Robert's funeral, I felt safe enough to cry. The tears spilled freely onto her shoulder, her familiar scent of lavender calming me as she whispered, "You're home here, Ellie. Whatever's happened, you're not alone." Inside her house radiated comfort. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee, the walls adorned with family photos and quilts she'd stitched by hand. I sank into her worn but inviting sofa, the kind of place that seemed to cradle broken hearts. The weight of the last 2 days loosened just enough for me to breathe. Rebecca poured me tea, her hand steady, her eyes never leaving mine as I tried to form the words. They showed up with suitcases. I finally said, my voice breaking. David, my own son, stood in front of the stairs to block me. And Caroline, she said this family was never mine. My throat closed around the memory, shame, and fury mixing until I felt I might choke. Rebecca gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. After all you've done for that boy, after everything you sacrificed. Oh, Eleanor, she shook her head, eyes glistening. And Robert, did he know what they were planning? I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the teacup. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the diary, setting it gently on the table between us. He didn't just know. He orchestrated it. I found this in his study. My voice trembled as I added, it's all in here. His affair, the money, the lies he fed David. Rebecca touched the leather cover as though it might bite her. She looked at me with something between horror and determination. You need help with this. More than I can give. But I know someone who can. She stood, her energy brisk, purposeful. There's a woman in town, Victoria Hayes. She used to work as a forensic accountant for the government. Sharp as a tack. Retired now, but she owes me a favor. The thought of involving a stranger made me nervous, but the urgency in Rebecca's tone steadied me. She reached for the phone, dialing quickly, explaining in hushed but firm words. Within an hour, a car pulled up outside. A woman in her late 60s stepped out, silver hair cut neatly, glasses perched on a nose that suggested years of stern precision. Victoria Hayes introduced herself with a firm handshake, her grip surprisingly strong. Rebecca tells me you've uncovered something that doesn't quite add up, she said, her voice low but commanding. I nodded, sliding the diary across the table toward her. I don't even know where to begin. All I know is he wasn't the man I thought I married. And now they've taken my home, my son, everything. Victoria opened the diary with the caution of someone handling evidence. Her eyes scanned the pages, quickly, lips pressed into a thin line. After several minutes, she closed it and looked up at me. If this is genuine, you're holding more than a confession. You're holding a map. These notes about transfers, offshore accounts, shell companies. This isn't just infidelity. This is fraud. Serious fraud. And it can be traced. Hope flickered, faintly fragile, but real. You think it's enough to prove what he did? Victoria's eyes softened just slightly. If the handwriting matches, and if we can tie these entries to actual bank movements, then yes. But you'll need records corroboration. And that's where I can guide you. She tapped the diary with a precise finger. This is the beginning, not the end. I leaned back, the weight in my chest shifting for the first time in days. Rebecca squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with pride. See? You're not beaten, Eleanor. You've got allies now. The warmth of her words, the calm authority in Victoria's tone settled into me like a steady flame. For so long I had felt like I was drowning in betrayal, clinging to nothing. Now, sitting at that kitchen table surrounded by women who believed in me, I felt the first spark of something stronger than grief. Resolve. I closed my eyes briefly, inhaling the scent of cinnamon and tea, letting the moment imprint itself on my heart. Robert had tried to erase me. David had turned his back. Caroline thought she had won. But they had underestimated me. And now, with Rebecca's friendship and Victoria's guidance, I had the first glimmer of a path forward. The night outside deepened, but for the first time since the funeral, I didn't fear the dark. I had the diary, I had allies, and I had hope. Victoria returned the next morning with her younger brother, James Hayes, a lawyer with the kind of sharp eyes that seemed to weigh every word before it was spoken. Rebecca poured coffee for all of us, but my stomach was too tight to drink. James flipped through the diary slowly, page by page, while Victoria pointed to certain entries, tapping the ink with her finger. This isn't just adultery, Eleanor, James said at last, closing the book with a measured sigh. This is criminal activity. Wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. If investigators connect you to any of this, they might not see you as a victim. They might see you as a co-conspirator. The word co-conspirator rang in my ears like a gavel. I shook my head furiously. I didn't know about any of it. I didn't even know the accounts existed. Victoria leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. We believe you. But belief isn't enough in court. Robert's entries mention you, and that can be twisted. The best move is to bring this to the police yourself before someone else does. At least then you look cooperative. My hands went cold. The idea of walking into a police station carrying evidence that could destroy what little was left of my reputation terrified me. But James and Victoria's expressions left no room for hesitation. By afternoon, I found myself sitting in a small sterile room at the Boston Police Department. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence until Detective Mark Wilson entered, a man in his 50s, with kind eyes that didn't quite soften the seriousness in his tone. He carried a file thick with papers and slid it across the table. Mrs. Miller, he began. Thank you for coming in. We've reviewed some information brought to our attention, and I need to ask you a few questions. He opened the file, pulling out a sheet of paper and turning it toward me. My breath caught. It was a bank authorization form, the name of an offshore account, written clearly, and beneath it, my signature. I froze. My own name stared back at me, curved in a way so familiar it made my stomach lurch. That's not mine, I whispered. That's a forgery. I never signed anything like that. Wilson studied me closely. You're certain it looks authentic, and the account is tied to funds matching the amounts referenced in your late husband's business dealings. I'm certain, I said louder now, my chest tightening. I would never risk something like this. I had no idea any of these accounts even existed until 2 nights ago. He set me up. Wilson didn't flinch, didn't comfort. He simply closed the file and folded his hands. I hear you, Mrs. Miller. But from a legal perspective, you're connected to an active investigation. Until we can prove otherwise, you are a person of interest. The words landed like a blow. My throat went dry. So, you think I could have helped him? I think your name is on documents tied to millions of dollars that vanished from American companies, Wilson replied evenly. Whether you knew or not is what we're here to determine. I felt the walls closing in the sterile air thick around me. For so long I had believed myself a victim, but now I was staring at the possibility of handcuffs courtroom's headlines. My mind raced back to Caroline's sneer, to David's cold eyes. Was this Robert's final gift to them? To leave me not just broken, but branded as guilty. Wilson excused himself briefly, leaving me alone in the room. I pressed my palms against the table, forcing myself not to crumble. Every instinct screamed to cry, to beg someone to believe me, but I swallowed it back. Tears would make me look weak. Weakness would make me look guilty. When he returned, James was with him, his lawyer's badge clipped visibly to his jacket. My client has cooperated fully, James said firmly. She's voluntarily here. She's given you the diary. That alone proves she's not hiding. Wilson nodded, conceding nothing but writing a note in his file. We'll be in touch. Don't leave Boston. As we walked out into the cool evening air, the city lights blurred through my unshed tears. Rebecca was waiting in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel anxiously. How did it go? She asked. I slid into the seat, my voice flat. They think I might be guilty. My own husband made sure of it. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had felt yet. Betrayed by Robert, abandoned by David, smeared by forged signatures. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was fighting for my very freedom. The call came from David just after dawn. His voice clipped, almost trembling, though he tried to sound in control. I found something in Dad's briefcase. A key. It's labeled First National Bank. They called and said his safe deposit box hasn't been touched since he passed. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My first thought was fear. What if it was more evidence tying me to his crimes? But the tremor in David's tone made me agree to meet him. By noon, we stood together in the marble lobby of First National. Our reflections stretched across the polished floor, the weight of silence between us nearly unbearable. The banker, a young man in a gray suit, guided us to the private vault room. He slid the brass key into the lock, turned it with a sharp click, and pulled out the long metal box. My stomach twisted as it was set before us on the table. "Only immediate family may open it," the banker said, nodding toward David and me. David's jaw clenched. His hand shook slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside was not cash, not jewels, but a small envelope with a USB drive and a folded sheet of paper. David reached for it first, but I placed my hand gently over his. "Let me," I said quietly. For the first time in weeks, he didn't argue. I unfolded the paper. Written in Robert's unmistakable handwriting were the words, "If you're reading this, the truth is out. Play the video." The bank staff provided a laptop in a nearby office. The screen flickered, and then Robert appeared sitting at his desk. His face older, tired but undeniably him. "I don't have much time." His voice began hoarse and heavy. "I need to set the record straight. To whoever finds this, most likely Eleanor or David. Know this, Caroline was my mistake. A long, shameful mistake. She was never part of this family, no matter what I told you. The fraud, the offshore accounts, all of it was mine. I forged signatures, including Eleanor's. She knew nothing. I wanted control, and I wanted to keep my secrets. If the law comes knocking, blame me alone." My knees went weak. I pressed a hand to the desk to steady myself as the video continued. I lied to my son. I made Eleanor look cold, controlling, so David would side with me. It was easier to shift the blame than to admit I was drowning in my own greed. But Eleanor was loyal. She deserved better. "If you have any sense of decency, clear her name." The screen went black. The silence afterward felt like thunder. David's face was pale, his hands balled into fists. He set you up," he whispered, his eyes flicking to mine, finally full of something other than contempt. Shame, maybe. Or doubt. All this time I thought. His voice cracked, and he didn't finish. I swallowed hard, my throat raw. "You thought I was the enemy. That's what he wanted." David rubbed his temples, breathing hard. For the first time since the funeral, he looked like my son again, lost and struggling. "Mom, I don't know what to believe anymore." I reached across the table, my hand trembling as it hovered over his. He didn't pull away. "Believe what you saw with your own eyes, David. That was your father admitting everything." Before he could answer, the office door swung open. A man in a dark, tailored suit entered, flanked by two others in plain clothes. His presence filled the room instantly, his smile sharp, calculated. "Mrs. Miller," he said smoothly, ignoring David entirely. "My name is Charles Donovan. I represent several interests connected to your late husband's business affairs." The way he said business made my blood run cold. He stepped closer, placing a card on the desk. "That video you just watched? It changes nothing. My clients still expect restitution. Robert may be gone, but debts remain. If you think a confession will erase them, you're mistaken." David stiffened, his eyes darting to me. "Who are you people?" Donovan's smile didn't falter. "People with far more power than your father ever had. And if Mrs. Miller doesn't cooperate, well..." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Grieving widows often make convenient scapegoats. So do wayward sons." My pulse hammered in my ears. Vanessa's cruelty had been venomous, but this man radiated something far more dangerous. Control influence, the kind that reached beyond family squabbles into something lethal. I straightened my back, clutching the purse with the diary inside. "I won't be intimidated," I said, though my voice trembled slightly. Donovan's eyes flickered with amusement. "Oh, Mrs. Miller, you already are." He nodded to his men, then strolled out as casually as if he'd been meeting a client for lunch. The door closed, and the room felt suffocating. David finally looked at me, fear replacing arrogance. "Mom, what have we gotten into?" I stared at the dark screen of the laptop, Robert's ghostly words echoing in my mind. For the first time, I realized the battle ahead wasn't just about clearing my name or surviving betrayal. It was about surviving a threat bigger than I had ever imagined. 2 days after that encounter at the bank, I was sitting at Rebecca's kitchen table with a cup of coffee I could barely taste when the knock came. Rebecca answered, and a young woman stepped inside, clutching a folder so tightly her knuckles were white. She couldn't have been more than 27 or 28, with nervous eyes that darted around the room before landing on me. "Mrs. Miller?" she asked softly. "Yes," I replied, wary. "My name is Jennifer Lawson. I used to work in accounting at Parker & Grant. I think you deserve to know the truth." Her voice trembled, but when she placed the folder on the table and opened it, her hands steadied. Inside were spreadsheets, emails, internal memos, all stamped with the company's logo. She pushed one page toward me. "This isn't just about your husband," she said. "The real architect behind everything was Martin Grant. He was Robert's partner, his so-called friend. But Martin, he designed the entire system. Offshore accounts, shell companies, falsified contracts. Your husband was complicit, yes, but Martin pulled the strings." I stared at the numbers, the coded transfers, the falsified invoices. "You're saying Robert wasn't the mastermind?" Jennifer shook her head firmly. "No. He was reckless, but Martin was deliberate, and Martin is still out there controlling everything. He has connections. Judges, politicians, even law enforcement. That's why the case keeps circling back to you. It's easier to make the widow take the fall than to drag Martin into court." David, who had been leaning against the counter, pushed off and walked over, disbelief etched across his face. "Are you telling me my father was just a puppet?" Jennifer's eyes softened. "A willing puppet. But yes, Martin Grant manipulated him, and now he's manipulating you by extension." She slid another paper forward. "Look at this. 2 weeks before Robert died, Martin redirected millions through accounts in your name. He made sure the trail pointed directly to you." My stomach churned as I read my own name on documents I had never seen. The walls seemed to tilt. Rebecca put a hand on my shoulder to steady me. "Why are you helping us?" I asked finally. Jennifer hesitated. Her voice dropped. "Because I was there. I saw too much. I left quietly, but Martin doesn't like loose ends. If he finds out I'm talking to you, it could ruin me. Or worse. But you deserve to know you're not crazy. You're fighting something much bigger than your family." David's jaw tightened. He turned to me, his expression filled with a mix of guilt and dawning realization. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't understand." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "None of us did." Before Jennifer could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. "He knows," she whispered. "Martin knows I came here." Rebecca quickly shut the blinds, her hands shaking. How Jennifer stuffed the papers back into the folder. "He has people everywhere. If I'm seen with you, we're all in danger." She pressed the folder into my hands. "Use this. Expose him. Don't let him bury you the way he buried Robert." And then she was gone, slipping out the back door into the night. The house fell into silence, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. I clutched the folder against my chest, my heart pounding. David finally spoke, his voice low. "Mom, we're not just dealing with Dad's mistakes anymore. We're up against Martin Grant." The name itself felt heavy, like a shadow stretching across the room. For the first time, I understood Vanessa's cruelty was nothing compared to this man. He was the storm behind the storm, the hand that had orchestrated everything. And now he had turned his gaze on me. I sat back, slowly staring at the folder in my lap, and felt a chill crawl down my spine. The game had changed. The enemy was no longer just within my family. It was a man who had the power to destroy lives without blinking. And he had already set his sights on mine. The phone rang just after dinner, the caller ID flashing State Correctional Facility. For a moment I froze, my fork still in my hand, before I picked it up. "Eleanor." The voice on the other end was strained, frantic. "Vanessa!" I almost hung up, but something in her tone stopped me. "They arrested me," she blurted out. "Fraud, conspiracy. They're pinning it all on me. Martin promised he'd take care of me, but he's cut me off. He won't answer my calls. He won't send a lawyer." "I'm finished, Eleanor." I stayed silent, gripping the phone tighter. Hearing her desperation stirred something bitter in me. This was the same woman who had looked me in the eye and said my family was never mine. "You're the only one who will listen," she pleaded. "Martin's not just ruthless, he's thorough. He's destroying every piece of evidence that could connect him. But I know where one piece is. Richard kept it hidden even from Martin. If you want to survive this, you need to listen." My chest tightened. "Why should I believe you?" "Because if Martin buries the truth, you'll take the fall for all of it," she said flatly. "Listen to me in the garden shed at the old house under the floorboards. There's a metal container. Richard put it there years ago. It's the only leverage left against Martin." Her voice cracked. "Please, don't let him erase me completely. Do something with it before it's too late." The line went dead. I stood frozen, the receiver still in my hand, when David came into the room. "Who was that?" I looked at him, my voice quiet. "Vanessa. She says Richard hid something in the shed." Within the hour, we were back at the old house. The night air in Brookline was cold, and the sight of that house, the home where I had lived for 3 decades, hit me like a blow. Its windows glowed warmly, but strangers lived there now. My life had been erased as though I had never belonged. The garden shed still stood at the back, half hidden by ivy. David carried a flashlight, its beam slicing through the dark. We slipped inside, the smell of earth and rust filling the air. She sat under the floorboards. I whispered. David crouched, prying at the warped boards with a crowbar. The wood groaned and splintered. My heart pounded in my ears until finally, with a sharp crack, one board gave way. Beneath it was a rusted metal container. David hauled it out, his hands dirty and trembling. We set it on an old workbench. My fingers shook as I turned the latch. The lid creaked open, and inside was a stack of papers sealed in plastic and a bundle of letters in Richard's handwriting. The first page was a confession dated 2014. Richard wrote about Martin's schemes in painstaking detail, the shell companies the judges bribed, the politicians paid off. He admitted he had been trapped too deep to climb out, terrified of Martin's reach. Then came the letter addressed to me. My throat tightened as I read, "Eleanor, if you are reading this, then Martin has won, and I have failed. I loved you once, but I lost myself to fear and ambition. I dragged you into a nightmare you never deserved. I cannot undo what I've done, but these documents may give you a way out. Protect David. Protect yourself. Don't trust anyone tied to Martin." Tears blurred my vision. For all his betrayals and his last desperate act, Robert had left me a lifeline. David flipped through the files, his face pale. "Mom. This is everything. Bribes, transfers, even emails with Martin's signature. This could bury him." I closed the lid on the container, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." In that dim shed with the scent of old wood and earth around us, I realized the tide had shifted. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I wasn't powerless. I held the weapon that could bring Martin Grant to his knees. Detective Wilson's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the papers we laid out on his desk. The garden shed files, Richard's letter, the detailed transfers. It was everything he needed. For once, the skepticism in his face gave way to determination. "This is enough," he said, tapping the folder. "I can take this to a judge. We'll have a warrant before sunrise." I sat rigid in the chair across from him, my hands clasped tightly together. "And Martin? He won't wait around," Wilson replied. "Men like him never do. He'll try to run." His words became truth faster than I imagined. By evening the next day, word came through Wilson's radio. Martin Grant was heading toward Logan Airport, his private jet fueled and waiting on the tarmac. David and I insisted on being there, though Wilson had warned against it. "Stay out of sight," he cautioned, as we rode in the unmarked SUV toward East Boston. "This isn't going to be pretty." The airport at night was a flood of lights and motion. Planes lifting off into the sky, service trucks buzzing across the ground, and beyond it all the private hangars where the wealthy slipped away from justice. Through the windshield, I saw Martin's black sedan glide to a halt near a sleek silver jet. He stepped out immaculate in his tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair catching the floodlights. He looked every bit the untouchable man of power he had always pretended to be. But then the scene shifted. Dozens of agents surged from the shadows, guns, raised voices, sharp and commanding. "Martin Grant, you are under arrest." Martin froze for half a second before trying to backpedal toward the car. The agents closed in, pinning him against the hood. He shouted something I couldn't hear, his voice lost beneath the roar of jet engines and the clicking of cameras. Because cameras were everywhere. Reporters had been tipped off, and within seconds their flashes lit the scene like a storm. Lenses, zoomed-in microphones thrust forward, catching the image of a billionaire mogul, wrists shackled, shoved into the back of a cruiser. David's hand tightened around mine. His voice was barely a whisper. "He's finished." I couldn't speak. For so long, Martin Grant had been a shadow, an invisible force too big to touch. To see him dragged down in front of the entire city, exposed, humiliated, was something I had scarcely dared to imagine. Wilson returned to us, his jaw set but his eyes softer now. "You did it," he said. "This is airtight. With the media coverage, he won't wriggle out. He'll face trial." I watched as Martin's car pulled away, red and blue lights reflecting across the tarmac. A lifetime of fear seemed to loosen its grip on my chest. The man who had orchestrated my husband's downfall, who had turned my son against me, who had nearly destroyed me, was now just another criminal in handcuffs. Yet even in that moment of vindication, I felt a sobering weight. Justice had come, yes, but the scars remained. Richard's betrayals couldn't be erased, and neither could the things Daniel had said or done. Still, as the night wind swept across the runway and the cameras turned toward us, I lifted my chin. For the first time since the funeral, I no longer felt like a woman walking into battle alone. Justice had spoken, and the man who thought himself untouchable was now behind bars. And deep down I knew this was only the beginning of a different fight, the one to piece together what was left of my family. James sat across from me at the long oak table in his office, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose as he carefully closed the last folder. The afternoon light slanted through the blinds, striping the room in warm gold. He looked up at me with something close to a smile. "It's done," he said gently. "The state has confirmed. Your name is cleared. The assets that were in your name legally, about $2.3 million, remain untouched. They're yours." For a moment I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled in my lap as I let the words settle. Cleared. Mine. Words I hadn't thought I would hear again. David squeezed my shoulder, his face soft with relief. "See, Mom, I told you the truth would come out." But before I could answer, the door creaked open and Daniel stepped inside. His eyes were red as though he had been crying for hours, and his shoulders slumped in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy who had lost a soccer game. He looked at me, not at James, not at David, at me. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve to even stand here." The room went silent. James quietly excused himself, giving us space. Daniel took a hesitant step closer. "I was wrong. I let anger and lies turn me against you. I let Vanessa poison everything between us. And I said things. God, I can't take them back. That day at the church." His voice cracked. "I can't stop hearing myself saying it. I don't know how you can even look at me." Tears burned my eyes, but I stayed still. I wanted him to keep talking, to empty everything he had buried. I went to court. He continued, his hands shaking. I testified against Vanessa. I told the truth. About what I saw, what I heard, what I knew Richard did. I stood up there and admitted I helped her. And I told the jury you had nothing to do with it. I couldn't stay silent anymore. His breath came in ragged gasps. I betrayed you, Mom. And if forgiveness is too much to ask, I'll take whatever you give me. But I need you to know, I'm done running from the truth. I stood slowly, my heart heavy with the weight of years and wounds. For so long I had dreamed of this moment, my son realizing the cost of his choices, and yet standing before me was not the arrogant man who had once told me to leave my own home. It was my son, raw, broken, stripped of all the defenses that had kept me at arm's length. I stepped closer, my voice soft, almost a whisper. Daniel, I forgive you. His eyes snapped up, wet with disbelief. But I added, my throat tight, forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. Trust takes time, and right now trust is something you'll have to earn back piece by piece. He nodded furiously, tears spilling down his cheeks. I will, Mom. I'll do whatever it takes. I promise you I will never let anyone turn me against you again. I reached out and touched his face, brushing away one tear with my thumb. For the first time in months, maybe years, I saw a glimmer of the boy I had raised, the boy who used to run into my arms without hesitation. But deep inside I knew this was only the beginning of a long road. Forgiveness opened the door, but rebuilding the bridge would take time, patience, and more honesty than we had ever managed before. I let my hand fall, stepping back, my voice steadier now. Then let's see what you do next. The room fell quiet again, but the silence felt different. Not heavy with betrayal, but fragile with possibility. For the first time, there was a thin thread of hope binding us again. Delicate, frayed, but real. A week later, I stood in the middle of my backyard, the spring air cool against my cheeks. The grass was damp with morning dew, and the earth smelled fresh like a promise waiting to be planted. Daniel carried a young apple tree in his arms, the roots wrapped in burlap, and set it down beside me. "Ready?" he asked, his voice tentative but softer than I remembered it being in years. I nodded. "Let's do it." We worked side by side in silence, digging into the soil. The shovel bit deep, turning over the earth that had been undisturbed since Richard's passing. Each thrust of the shovel felt like shedding another layer of pain. Daniel dug harder than he needed, to sweat beading at his temples, as if trying to bury his guilt along with the roots. I let him. When the hole was finally ready, he lowered the tree into place. Together we shoveled the dirt back in, packing it tight around the base. My hands, lined and weathered, pressed against the soil with his sealing the roots. We stood back, and for the first time in so long, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. This apple tree wasn't just a plant. It was a marker of survival, of forgiveness, of the possibility that what had been broken could still grow again. Rebecca and Victoria arrived later that afternoon, bringing a basket of fresh bread and a bottle of wine. Rebecca hugged me tight, whispering in my ear, "You're stronger than any of us ever knew." Victoria, practical as always, placed her hand on my arm. "That tree will outlive all of us. That's the kind of legacy you deserve." We sat on the porch together, the four of us, the apple tree standing in the yard like a sentinel of new beginnings. Daniel stayed quiet most of the time, listening, learning, letting the warmth of their presence sink into the spaces where coldness had lived for too long. As the sun dipped low, I found myself speaking words I hadn't even planned. "I've been given a second chance," I said softly. "Not just with my son, but with my life. I want to do something that matters with it." Rebecca tilted her head. "What are you thinking?" I looked out at the tree, the last rays of sunlight catching on its tender leaves. "I'm going to set up a fund. For women like me, women who've been stripped of their security, manipulated, silenced. They deserve someone to stand with them while they rebuild." Victoria's eyes glistened, and she nodded in approval. Daniel looked at me, surprise flickering across his face, then pride. "That's incredible, Mom. Dad's money finally going somewhere good." I smiled faintly. "It's not about Dad anymore. It's about what we do with what's left." The evening ended quietly, laughter threading between us in small, careful bursts. For the first time in months, I didn't dread tomorrow. Later, alone in my room, I sat by the window with a cup of tea watching the apple tree sway gently in the night breeze. My heart no longer felt like it was caged in grief and betrayal. Instead, it felt like it had room again. Room for forgiveness, for growth for myself. My voice, steady now, carried the weight of all that had passed, and all that lay ahead. I lost my husband. I nearly lost my son. I lost the house I thought was my sanctuary. But in the end, I found something greater. I found myself, the bond of motherhood, and the strength I never knew I had. I let the words settle in the quiet of the room, a truth I could finally believe. And then, almost as if I were speaking to someone just beyond the glass, I added, "If you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever been told you were powerless, remember this. Your truth and your strength will always find a way back to you." That was my story. And it wasn't the end. It was the beginning.